Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. Creepy, right? But that's not quite what happened. On the morning of August 4th, 1892, Lizzie Borden, the youngest of the Borden sisters, yelled to her maid Maggie, "Come down quick!" Lizzie's father was dead. 69-year-old Andrew Borden lay on the sofa, his face battered almost beyond recognition. He had been hacked to death by what is assumed to be a hatchet. Lizzie sent Maggie to fetch the doctor, but she couldn't find him, so she was sent to bring Lizzie's friend and neighbor, Adelaide Churchill. The authorities had already arrived and were busy looking for any signs of an intruder when Maggie and Adelaide made a horrifying discovery in the second-floor guest bedroom: the hacked-down body of Abby Borden, Lizzie's stepmother. 64-year-old Abby Borden received 18 blows to the back of her head, while Andrew had been struck around 10 times on the left side of his face. The police couldn't find any apparent motive, nothing was stolen, and the victims did not show any signs of sexual abuse. The papers did not waste time reporting the gruesome crime, and the people of Fall River, Massachusetts were not only shocked at the brutality of the crime, but by who the victims were. Andrew Borden was a wealthy man who originally came from a well-to-do family but later invested in real estate, mills, and banks. The Bordens regularly attended church and were seemingly respected members of society. They lived in a fairly modest house for the time, in a street that was increasingly populated by immigrants, much to the disappointment of his daughters, 41-year-old Emma and 32-year-old Lizzie, both of which still lived at home. This made them resent their father, because they knew he could very well afford to move to the much more glamorous neighborhood named The Hill. Emma and Lizzie reportedly did not get along with their stepmother. Their birth mother, Sarah Morse, died when they were only 11 and 2. Andrew married Abby only 2 years after the passing of his first wife. As the days passed and the police couldn't find evidence that an intruder had done this, their attention turned to the residents of the home. Emma and John, Sarah's brother, were ruled out. Emma was out of town visiting a friend, and John Morse, who had dropped by the house unannounced the day before, was taking a walk around town at the time of the murders. Maggie, whose real name was Bridget, by the way, was upstairs in her bedroom resting after having washed the windows in the house, so she, too, was ruled out. That left only Lizzie. District Attorney Hosea Knowlton interrogated Lizzie along with Bridget Sullivan, John Morse, and others in an inquest held in the courtroom above police headquarters. Unfortunately for Lizzie, her answers contradicted each other, and she was arrested 2 days later. She entered a not guilty plea to the charges, but at her preliminary hearing, the judge said she was, quote, probably guilty, and ordered she face a grand jury. In November of the same year, the grand jury met, and at first, they refused to issue an indictment. But then, they heard new evidence from family friend Alice Russell. She told the jurors that she saw Lizzie burn a blue dress in the kitchen the days following the killings, using the excuse that it was covered in old paint. Pair that with Maggie's earlier testimony that Lizzie was wearing a blue dress the morning of the crime, and that did it. Lizzie was charged with the murder of her parents. The trial began on June 5, 1893. It consisted of 3 judges, Chief Justice Mason, Justice Blodgett, and Justice Dewey, and a jury of 12 men. The prosecution was argued by district attorneys Hosea Knowlton and William Moody. Lizzie, of course, could afford to be represented by the best legal team, attorneys Andrew Jennings and George Robinson, who was the former governor of Massachusetts. For 2 hours, D.A. Moody explained that she was the only person that had both the motive and opportunity to commit the double murders. Even though the actual murder weapon was never found, he went on to show the head of a hatchet the police had found in the house and said that was the weapon Lizzie had used to carry out the killings. At some point in his speech, Moody threw the frock of the blue dress they claimed she was wearing onto the table, revealing the battered skulls of Andrew and Abby. That reportedly made Lizzie faint for several minutes. The state had several witnesses testify, including Bridget Sullivan, Alice Russell, and others. Even though Bridget, aka Maggie, testified that she never saw a bad relationship between Lizzie and her stepmother, prosecution witness Hannah H. Gifford said that Lizzie called her stepmother, quote, a mean, good-for-nothing thing. Bridget also mentioned that the Bordens, except for Lizzie and Emma, had a stomach ache the day before the murders. DA Moody then asked Russell to describe the dress burning incident. Alice said that when she asked Lizzie what she was doing with that dress, Lizzie replied, quote, "I am going to burn this old thing up. It is covered with paint." When defense attorney Robinson questioned her during cross-examination, he quite plainly suggested that a guilty person would not get rid of incriminating evidence in such an obvious way. Russell also testified that according to Lizzie, that morning Abby received a note summoning her to visit a sick friend. This note is what Lizzie used to excuse herself when she was questioned about why she didn't immediately think to look for her stepmother when she found her father's body. This note was never found. Alice said that she sarcastically suggested that Abby had burned the note, and Lizzie simply replied, "Yes, she must have." The state wanted Lizzie's initial testimony, the one where she contradicts herself several times, to be admitted as evidence. Still, the panel of judges rejected it, saying that Lizzie, who at the time of the testimony did not have her lawyer present, was practically a prisoner. As such, she should have been informed of her right to remain silent. The prosecution's final attempt to prove Lizzie's guilt was useless. They tried to have pharmacist Eli Benz testify in front of the jurors that Lizzie had tried to buy 10 cents worth of poison from him the day before the murders occurred. The judges had the jurors exit the courtroom before this testimony, however, and after they heard it, they decided it should not be presented as evidence. The defense sure took advantage of the many holes the state's case had. According to the prosecution's timeline, 8 to 13 minutes passed from Andrew's murder to Lizzie calling Maggie. So, how, they argued, could she have washed the blood off of her clothing, and also hide the murder weapon in such a reduced span of time? Keep in mind the type of clothing used by women at the time. Defense attorney Robinson ridiculed the idea that Lizzie committed the crime stark naked to avoid getting blood on her dress. The defense presented only a handful of witnesses and mainly relied on cross-examining the state's own witnesses. Dr. C. Barry Bowen, who was called to testify by the prosecution, repeated Lizzie's story that she was in the barn looking for lead sinkers at the time of his father's murder. Also, that she thought her father's problems with his tenants might have something to do with his demise. In cross-examination, he agreed with the defense when they suggested his prescription of morphine for Lizzie might explain why her answers were confusing and contradictory. The defense witnesses Charles Gifford and Uriah Kirby testified they saw a strange man near the Borden house the night before the murders. A plumber and a gas fitter testified that in the day or two before the murders, they had been in the Borden's barn. This cast doubt on the police's argument that Lizzie's alibi was questionable because the dust in the barn looked undisturbed. Lizzie's older sister, Emma, told the jury that her sister and father had a good relationship. She said Lizzie and Abby were cordial to each other and did not have a bad relationship. However, she did admit her resentment towards their father, resulting from his transferring the house to Abby and her sister. In their closing speech, the defense concluded that the state hadn't been able to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and that it was impossible for Lizzie to have committed the crime in the timeline suggested by the prosecution. D.A. Knowlton summed up the prosecution's evidence, and Justice Dewey charged the jury, but not before telling them to take into account Lizzie's exceptional Christian character, which according to him, entitled her to every inference in her favor. After deliberating for only an hour and a half, the jury returned with their verdict, not guilty. Lizzie reportedly let out a yell and fell to her chair. She then covered her face and let out a second cry of joy. 2 months after Lizzie's acquittal, the Borden sisters finally got what they so desperately longed for. They bought and moved into a large house on the hill. But Lizzie was tormented by the crimes until her death. People in general shunned her, and when she withdrew to her house because of it, the kids in the neighborhood bugged her with awful pranks. In 1905, the sisters had a falling out, and Emma moved out of their house Maplecroft. Strangely enough, they both died in 1927, only 9 days apart. They were both buried next to their father. Did Lizzie Borden resent her father and stepmother so much that she was capable of murdering them? Or did an intruder do this? And if so, how did they manage to escape completely undetected?